Hello everyone, and welcome to this Blender 2.64 overview video from CG Cookie. My name is Jonathan Williamson, and today I'm going to give you a run-through of a lot of the new features that have been added to Blender 2.64. This is the latest release as of this recording, and it was released yesterday. We've got a lot of new things in 2.64 to play with. We've got a lot to learn, and I'm going to try and just give you a run-through of a lot of the major things with this. I'm not going to be able to cover everything. Some of the things I'm not very familiar with, and so can't really talk knowledgeably on, but I'm going to try and give you an introduction to a lot of it. So first of all, one of the really big things in this release is it's very VFX heavy. Due to the Tears of Steel short film just recently finished by the Blender Foundation as the Mango project, one of the goals of that project was to develop the VFX tools within Blender to a substantial degree and to make them usable, and also just develop a lot of new tools that we didn't previously have. And so this release is very VFX heavy, but it's not all VFX. So let's just real quick browse through some of the release notes. So here on the release notes, which you can find from the download page as well, you can give a quick overview as far as some of the things that were added. And again, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I'm going to do my best to show you at least a few of them to kind of give you a taste of what's in this release and some of the things that maybe you've missed. Number one of the biggest new features is we have a full mask editor and masking support. So whether you're doing compositing or just want to do, various either compositing, sequencing, you name it, we've got a full mask editor developed directly in Blender now that allows us to create vector-based masks that are then rasterized on the fly. We can then feed these into the compositor and mask out our images or our compositions very, very easily. So I'll be running you through a little bit of that. We've got some updates to our motion tracker for tracking footage. Primarily it now allows planar tracking and tripod tracking. Now I'm not going to be talking about this at all today because frankly I don't know anything about it, and if I were to do that, I would just make a fool of myself, which I might anyway, but I'll let you go ahead and read through that. So if you just jump over to the motion tracker page, you can read a lot of the details about the planar tracking, tripod tracking, etc. So if you're wanting to do some tracked footage, there's definitely a lot of improvements that'll be of interest to you. We've also got updates to green screen keying, allowing us to get much better green screen tools within Blender. We've got updates to the compositing nodes with several new nodes, a lot of new little features, and just some usability things. We've got full color management in Blender now via the Open Color IO is now integrated directly into Blender, allowing us to get correct color management for various displays and such. This is another topic where I'm just going to show you where it's at in Blender. I can't speak with any knowledge whatsoever on color management. As just the other day I was reading about it a lot, and while I understand the basis of color management, I'll just say that color management makes my head hurt. But if you want to read more about it and read about the details, then that's definitely, a lot of good reads here. Next, we've got a lot of updates to the Cycles render engine. We've got a new non-progressive integrator with finer control over the sampling. We have tiled rendering support. We've got several new nodes. Got a lot of new features on Cycles. So I'm going to be showing you a little bit of that today. We've got some small minor updates to the sequencer for usability. We've also got some new mesh modeling tools and updates to some modeling tools. And a huge feature is we now have sculpt masking. So this was kind of almost sidelined next to the VFX stuff, but due to a lot of the excellent work from the developers, we now have full masking control while sculpting in Blender. We've also got a brand new modifier called the skin modifier, which makes it very easy to create base meshes and things like that very quickly. The B Surfaces add-on, which is an incredible add-on that's bundled with Blender now, has been updated. Now anyone that's downloaded this themselves or have been working with development builds will be familiar with a lot of the updates, and I'm not going to go through them today. I just want to focus on the core Blender features. But B Surfaces 1.5, if you haven't looked at it, you definitely should because it's really, really cool. We've also got some updates for the game engine, particularly with shadowing. We've got some major updates to the Collada exporter, giving many more options and good Second Life support. And then we've got a variety of other small features and an amazing list of bug fixes. If you just scroll through the list here, you can see the number of fixes that have been added is pretty substantial. So let's jump right over to Blender, and I've set up a kind of a sample scene here where I'm just going to go through each one of these sections. So these are each of the things that I wanted to talk about. So let's start off first with compositing. So we've got a lot of new things with compositing, but the single biggest addition to compositing is completely under the surface and you won't hardly notice it, but it's what's referred to as the tiles compositor. And all compositing is now tiles based, and it's also OpenCL accelerated for the most part. So we've got huge performance enhancements. It's much, much faster now, and we've got some additional abilities to tweak the performance. So for example, here in the side view here in properties panel, here along the bottom, you can see that we have performance options, and we can now set whether it's to render at low, medium, or high quality at both render time and while editing. So if you want to speed up the editing process and don't need to see your results at full quality, you can simply set the quality here, and that will then base it off there. We've also got chunk size support, which I don't know too much about this, but definitely check out the compositing section within the release notes right here. And you can see a lot of those. Here we go. I believe it's under compositing nodes. Yeah, here we go. So it's tile based. So definitely read through a lot of this stuff because there's a lot of really cool detail about what's going on under the surface and such. And for the stuff that I'm definitely not familiar with, such as chunk size, just read the release notes and you can get a lot of the cool details and links to further documentation. We've also got a few more options down here, such as OpenCL acceleration, 2-pass, highlight, and hide preview. The main thing with OpenCL is some of the nodes, which you can find actually listed here under OpenCL, do support OpenCL acceleration now for doing processing on the graphics card, and those nodes that support it are these ones, which the bokeh blur, the defocus, the dilate and erode, and the directional blur. All of these nodes tend to be very processor intensive, and so now these nodes specifically are OpenCL accelerated, giving much faster results. And then highlight is kind of cool. It's just a user interaction where if we just enable this highlight, and if I just say Control Shift click on this node, you won't see it very much, but if I were doing a very processor intensive node, it will highlight in orange the node that is currently processing under the scene, allowing you to kind of see where things are at, make sure it's not stalled or anything like that. So that's the big compositing feature is all under the surface, but we've got a bunch of other stuff too. You'll notice that some of my nodes are green now. So such as this node here, we now have the ability to set a custom color. So you can simply choose custom color and then set that color to whatever you wish. And then that just, a visual control for better organization or just quickly visually recognizing specific nodes. You will also notice that this is a brand new node where we have this new color management node, which just gives us very good controls over the saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, lift, for all of the different, the master, the mid highlights, midtones, shadows, etc. And so this just gives us very easy controls to do some basic color management here for really tweaking the final result of our image and making sure that it's exactly what we want. So that's one of the new nodes. You can find that node under the color menu for color correction. We've got another new node right here that's really, really cool called a switch, which you can find via the layout group now, where we have layout and frame, reroute, and switch. So switch is very cool. A lot of times, if you want to compare two different results very easily, or maybe there's certain parts of the scene or the composite that you only want to be active at certain parts of the animation, you could actually keyframe this, and you can then switch between those two to see which one you want. And like I said, you can actually keyframe this result just by hovering over and pressing I, and so you could toggle that on or off at any point within your animation to, either for optimization, for visual purposes, whatever it is that you want, you could do that. Then moving over here, you can see we've got another layout option, which is the reroute point. And the reroute point is one of my favorite new features because it allows us to literally reroute nodes or to add in intersection points. And so what this is basically is just essentially a node dot, an input or output that we can just put wherever in space. So if we hit Shift A, add in a layout and reroute, you can see I just have this little point that I can then position anywhere that I want. Maybe we'll just drop it right on there. And then I can pull out or in from that point at any time. So one really good usage of this is if you have, say, a lot of nodes that are all reading from the same input. If you've ever tried to, if you had something like this, like imagine you had a whole bunch of these colors. In fact, let's just do this. So imagine we've got a bunch of these, and we'll just connect all of these like that. So we can have all of these different nodes all connected to the same point. And if we ever wanted to swap out this render layer, say for an image or something, but swap it out for something that would break this connection, we no longer have to reroute or reconnect every single one of these. We can simply kill the connection right there and then feed the new one in just like that. It works beautifully. The other thing that it's really good for is organizational purposes. Like if your connection's starting to get really messy or you've got a lot of nodes going on, you could just add in a new reroute, which by the way you can do by holding down Shift, left click and dragging, and anywhere you drag across will add a reroute point. And you could simply, pull this up there, or you could pull it down, or use it as a organizational thing very, very easily. The next node that we have here is we've got a couple new masking nodes that are pretty cool. And we've got a box mask and several other. We've got a box mask and an ellipse mask that allow us to basically add in a simple mask. So for example, here, I've got this color overlay that's going over my original render, which you can see is I have a render here and a render here, which are then being combined to give me the combined result. But my original cylinder is just gray, and then I've just overlaid a blue color on it using a color blending mode. And if I wanted to, say, only have a stripe across this, that'd be a little challenging to do without some weird complex masks, unless we have something like this. So I can just connect that in, and now I have my stripe very easily, and I can go in, I can change the rotation on this. Just like that. I can set the mask type, so if you're combining multiples of these, then you can do that very easily. You can tone down the value, you can set the position. So you've got a lot of control as far as positioning this. It's a little finicky to position because you've got to do it all by values. You can't just grab it and move it, but it's, a pretty good quick mask if you need to just drop that in. And like I said, we do have an ellipse mask as well that works quite well. So those are a couple of the new things in the compositing stuff, but let's go on down here now and let's check out the green screen tools. So the green screen tools are pretty cool. And again, I'm only going to very briefly touch on this because I know nothing about green screening. I'm not a compositor, but I'll at least show you kind of where the tools are. So first of all, here is my sample green screen image, which is from the Mango project, and it's provided in the release notes, and you can find it real quick. I just sent it through a scale node just to stretch it down to the render size, just so that it's not huge like you could see here. And then we have this new keying node, and the keying node can be found from Matte and Keying. Keying screen is also new. I don't know anything about the keying screen node yet, but again, check out the release notes in the green screen section right here. And you can go in, you can read about each one of the individual settings, pre-blur, despill, edge kernel radius, etc. And then the keying screen node and whatnot. So that we've got a much better green screening tools, and without changing any of the settings, I think I maybe tweaked a couple of these just barely. On this node, all I did is I went in, grabbed the color, sampled the background color here, and then I'm left with that by enabling transparency here, which then if I send it through an alpha over, I can very easily change the background color very, very easily, or I could put an image back here or anything else of the sorts. Now again, I know nothing about green screening, and so this is not a complete the complete key. There's a lot of other stuff that you'd want to do with this for cleaning up and fine tuning, but you can see here in the release notes, a pretty good example is, they start with this, they go here for then the mask, and then they can posit it over the final backdrop. So we've got much better green screening tools within Blender that are pretty cool. We've got another thing right up here, which, actually, no, that's for masking. Let's talk about that here in just a moment. Actually, you know what? Let's jump right over to masking. So we'll just go to masking now, since it kind of ties in with the compositing stuff. So the masking tools are really, really cool because we've got the ability to, again, draw the masks directly within Blender. So you can, again, read through the release notes here for all of the details, but I'm just going to give you a very quick run through on doing a bit of this. So let's jump over into my masking scene here. And what I've set up is I have this image here of my dog. And let's just say we want to mask out his head or something like that. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, show the viewer node directly in the image editor. So I'll just go to the viewer node, and you'll see why I'm doing this here in just a moment. And then in the UV image editor or the movie clip editor, it works in both, we now have a new mask mode. And in this mask mode, we can now click new because we have this new mask data block. And we can see it's here. So here's my mask. And if we go over here in the properties panel, or actually that's the toolbar, we have mask setting, mask layers, and mask display. And so if we just click the plus sign on mask layers, we've added in a new mask layer. And the way that we then add masking points, you'll notice there's nothing in the menus or anything, so you kind of got to know the hotkeys, which all of the hotkeys are listed in the bottom here for the selection, curve handles, feathering, etc. But what we can do is if we just control left click, we can insert a new mask point. And then we can control click again and again and again. And this is essentially like extruding individual vertices in edit mode, where we can very easily go in and then just basically trace out what we want in our mask. And now, maybe we'll go around his fur instead. So we can select things with just right clicking, and you'll see a couple of things with this mask, but I'll show you those in here in just a moment. So let's just go around like this. This is not a practical mask or anything, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So here we go. And then once we get up all the way around, if we want to enclose this mask to make it go, full circle, we don't actually connect the two. We can't just select the two and hit F or connect them or any way. All we want to do is we want to make the mask cyclic. So what we can do, or cyclic, however you want to pronounce it, is down here in the active spline, you can either click cyclic or you can hit Alt-C. And that will then connect the two so that we have a complete circle. Then what we can do here is right now you'll notice that my mask is just a wireframe. I can't really see anything. So let's bounce over to the compositor real quick and let's hit Shift A, and we're going to add in a new input and mask. So mask is a new input. We can just bring it over here and we can then choose the mask that we want. So we have this mask, so we'll choose that. And if we visualize that by hitting Control Shift left click, we can see exactly what the mask looks like. And if we wanted to then view this over our original image or anything, you can see this is why I connected or showed the viewer node here, is it allows us to actually see the actual mask. It's not real time, but it's actively processing, and it's very cool. So let's real quick look at what we can use this mask for. So if we add in just say a color and mix node, let's just drop that right on there. And let's set this to, we'll just set it to color. And if we visualize this then, right now it's at a white, but if I go in and I set this to, any one of these colors, let's just say something like, we'll go orange. We'll make him orange. Right now it's just coloring the entire thing. But if I then feed this mask directly into the factor, it's only going to color in the portion of the mask. And so this is really cool because, this is what masking's for and why it's very, very powerful, because now we can customize this mask at any point. I can go over here. I can turn it on or off. So this is just the viewport editing, turn off the editability of it, or turn it off at render time, and that will just immediately disable the mask. I can go and I can set the overall opacity for this. So as I turn this down, you'll see it gets less and less and less. There we go. We'll just go back up to 1 for this though. I can go ahead and invert the mask just like that. I can set the blending type, and this is for when you're working with multiple masks. And so within this mask data block, we can add multiple layers. So now in this second layer, I could go in and say I'll mask in, parts of his body or something. We'll just do something very, very quick, and I'll hit Alt-C to make it cyclic. And there we go. So now what we could do is, right now these are merging them together, but we could simply subtract them. We could darken it. We can do, all kinds of different, we can set all the different blending modes to see how we want those masks to interact with each other. In this case, I'll just delete that. We do also have some mask display options as far as white, black, dashed, outline, etc. So we've got some different options there. We can whether or not to show smooth splines or not. Now this will probably be a little bit more processor intensive, so you have to have a lot of masks. You may not want to do that. And then we have a couple other options relating to feathering. So let's check out feathering. So in feathering, how this works is, number one, with each one of our points here, actually, before we talk about feathering, let's talk about working with the handles. So right now, all we've done is we've extruded the handles, but we have this extra little control point here that allows us then to go in. Let's just grab a better sample. Here, we'll do this one. So I can grab this little control point, and then I can pull this out to make it softer and rounder and also manipulate the way that curve is working. So that just allows us to manipulate that a little better. We can also select it, and if we choose the active point down here, and we can set the handle type to either auto, vector, or aligned. You can also do this by pressing V in the viewport, so I can set that to vector, and now it's just a single sharp point. Or we'll set it to auto, or we can go to aligned, which then gives us the extra little handle. So those are the control points. But now let's talk about feathering. So feathering is a very important topic in masking because right now I just have a 100% solid mask. It's got sharp edges. It's not very nice. We do have some anti-aliasing features in here where we can make that smoother and feathering options. But right now, no feathering is happening. But the way that feathering works so that we can get nice soft results is if you select your mask, hit Shift, left click and drag. Oops, that's not right. Let's select all points with A, and then hit Shift, left click and drag around or on one of the points, I believe. Let's see if I do this right. I'm fairly incompetent with some of the masking tools. Okay, so what was happening is I was doing it right, but I was going the wrong way. So with the masking, the feathering goes out essentially. So if I select all my points, Shift, left click and drag, you can see that it then just brings out this green line here. And I've got an additional point there. There we go. And then that is going to then feather it out. And so now if we look at this, if we look at our mask, we can see it's very nicely feathered here. And if I now grab any one of these points, I can go in and pull it out further. Now you can't select these individual points, but if you go and select one of these, then Shift, left click and drag, then you can pull those out. It's a little funky. It takes a little getting used to, but once you kind of get it, then it definitely works. But again, it definitely does take a bit of getting used to see exactly how it works. If you select an individual point, the easiest way to increase or decrease the size of the mask is simply hit Alt-S, and that will grow that feather in or out. So if you select all points, Alt-S will then make it small or large. One other thing with the feathering, so if we make this really soft, we can do something like that. We do have a few options down here for the feathering, such as feather even or smooth. We've got the weight for either linear or ease, and definitely read more up on that on the release notes. But then one other thing that we have is the self-intersection check. So you can see up in here, we're getting something kind of funky where this is intersecting itself. So if we click self-intersection, it's going to prevent any of those self-intersections by just removing it right there. And that'll just give us a nicer, more even result and make sure that we don't have any weird self-intersections. But just something to kind of look at and improve as you go along. So that's basic masking and feathering. I hope to do a complete tutorial on this a little bit later because I know this is maybe a little bit confusing and takes a little while to get used to. One thing that I will note here as a kind of important note is, in general, do your masking from or go counterclockwise. The reason being is that the direction of these handles absolutely matters, because if you go clockwise, you can see that the handles point in, and it almost seems like it works. But then if you select it, hit Alt-S, and you bring your feather in, you'll notice it doesn't do anything. And this is because it needs to be reversed. So if you select it, and you can just hover over it and hit L. So here we go, just hit L while over it. If you hit a space bar and type in reverse, or I think is it change direction? Yeah, switch direction. You can then hit enter, and that will swap the direction of those points, and then your feathering will work. And so that's just something you want to be aware of, is that the handles need to point out in order for your feathering to actually show up. Definitely spent a long time trying to figure that out. So if you create your mask counterclockwise, they'll automatically point out. If you go clockwise, they'll go in. But you can select any one point and just reverse that direction quite easily. So as long as you're aware of that, then you're good to go. So that's basic masking. There's obviously a lot more detail with it. There's more things you can do. You can animate your mask. You can parent your mask points or entire mask to tracking points. There's a lot of things you can do, but that's a topic for another day. Let's move on now, and let's look at cycles. So cycles is definitely kind of the favorite toy of a lot of people. It's the new-ish render engine now, developed primarily by Brecht van Lommel, that is node-based and very, very cool and very powerful. It's also what they rendered Mango in, I believe almost exclusively. Some shots may have been rendered with the Blender internal for things like smoke, but Cycles is very cool. So there's a lot of new improvements with Cycles. One of the first most prominent notes is that spot lamps are now supported. So previously spot lamps were not supported, but now they are. And so if you select your spot lamp, you go over to the lamp settings, you can see we've got the option to set the size and set in the blend, which you can see represented in the 3D viewport by this additional circle. So if we bring that all the way out, You can see this line here gets sharper and sharper and sharper. So we've got that ability. We can also, well, I don't know what, showing the cone in solid view will show it like that so that you can see it. So that's the main thing with spot lamps. But we've got a lot of other features. If we look at the release notes, there's a lot of things with cycles that have been updated. If we take a look here, cycles rendering. So we've got, number one is we now have multi-threaded BVH building, which is this stuff right here. And basically that's the pre-building that it does before it starts rendering your scene. So if you've ever worked on a complex scene and you just sit there waiting, sometimes minutes for it to build the BVH and actually start rendering, this process is now multi-threaded and is much, much faster. Most scenes are at least 2 times faster, but I know that I worked on some scenes that I was seeing, 10 times the speed increase. So much, much faster for that. Image loading is also multi-threaded now, and so particularly if you're working with large texture files or HDRI probes or anything like that, those will also load much faster now. We've got a series of new nodes. We've got the object info node. We've got the particle info node. We have a new brick texture and image, or brick texture for generating procedural bricks. We have blended box mapping support for image textures, which is one of the things I'm going to show you, which is pretty cool. We also have support for image sequences now, and the limit of the number of images for the CPU rendering has now been removed completely. We got a few other things like normal support for texture coordinates. We've got a light fall off node, which is pretty cool. We've got ray length support now as a light path so that we can modify things based on the length of the ray as it's going through objects and such. I'm not going to show you this today, but it can be used for some kind of like fake subsurface scattering and things like that. That is pretty cool. And one of the big things is that we have a non-progressive integrator now. Now, this is not something that I can speak very knowledgeable on, so I'm just going to show you where it's at. I'm not going to try and pretend to know enough about it, but, read through the release notes. It's pretty cool. We've also got some render layer and pass controls, so like we can exclude specific layers now. We've got support for motion vector and UV passes, and one of my favorites is the ability for per render layer samples control, which I'll look at in a moment. And then we've got a couple other features, such as the filter glossy, which can be used for reducing noise. And we've got some panoramic fisheye cameras now as rendering modes for the individual cameras. So let's bounce back over to Blender and take a look at a couple of these things. Let's first go in and look at a few of the nodes. So I'm just going to select my floor here. And on the floor, I've set up 2 different shaders. The first one is just a bare one, but then I've got another shader here called the brick shader. And you can immediately see what happens is it's now generating this, almost like a wood paneling effect. Now, I didn't spend a lot of time on this, so it definitely, needs a little bit more love. But the way this works basically is we now have this brick texture node, which can be found from the texture input and brick right here at the bottom, and allows us to set things like offset, frequency, the 3 separate colors, so white, gray, and then the mortar color. We've got scale, so I can increase or decrease this size. We've got the mortar size, the bias, the brick width, the row height, all these different features that we can then use to create some kind of cool brick or wood paneling textures that are all procedural, that then when mixed with actual textures or other procedurals and bump maps, you can create some pretty convincing results. So it's a pretty good, I won't say a shortcut necessarily, but another alternative for quickly generating procedural textures that, when handled right, can give you some really, really great results. So that's the main thing with the brick texture node. But now let's take a look at some of the other ones that we added. Namely, we've got the blended box mapping, which is very, very cool. And the way that this works is, let me switch this back over to flat real quick. So if we just feed in our color here, I'm going to feed it into this glossy, you can see that our images here now have this kind of like rusted metal paneling texture on it. And it's a little hard to tell what it is at the moment because it's all stretched out and it's pretty nasty. And, I could UV unwrap these, but if I want to just very quickly put something together, UV unwrapping is pretty tedious and, it's maybe not going to give me the results that I want if I'm just quickly focused on getting a sample or something like that. But what we have now is this blended box mapping mode, which is incredibly cool. So we just switch over to box, and basically what it does is it projects the image from each direction. So something, in all directions, there we go, like this. and then kind of blends the corners together based on the blending amount. So you won't maybe see it here, but if we just increase the blending, that's going to soften the transition between them and give us a pretty nice result. So now you can see that, you know, without doing any UV mapping or anything, I've got a pretty good result here that at least is going to give me a very good impression of what I'm going for and kind of what I want. So very, very cool tool. And actually, here's one example where you can see at the bottom, as it clears up, you can see that there's a definite tile right here. So if we just increase the blending like that, wait for this to go away, you can see that tile has then kind of been blended together. Basically, it uses like gradient masking of sorts to then just combine them together. So you might lose some detail in here, and that's why you can fine tune the blending. But as a quick tool, it works really, really well. So that's the blended box mapping. Another one is, I'm not going to show you all the things, but let's look at the object info node. So the object info node is pretty cool. It can be found from the input object info and allows us to input the location of objects, the object index, the material index, or a random value. And in this case, I'm going to use the random value. And what it then allows us to do is to very easily and quickly, let's just feed that into there, basically add dynamic color variation to all of our different objects. And so if I were to say, take this, I'll duplicate it over. Oops, I duplicated the wrong one. We'll grab that one. We'll duplicate it here. We'll duplicate this up. And so you can see that as I duplicate these, they're each basically getting a different color, you know, either red or blue. But they're getting a specific different color. And this is, I'm not defining which ones gets it. It's just random. And it's getting a solid different color because I've fed in this color ramp here, which is then set to constant. And so by putting the white here in the center, it's basically saying, okay, this is either, based on this random seed, it's either going to feed black or it's going to feed white. And so then when it gets fed into the factor value here, it's going to choose one of these colors to then assign to the glossy shader here. And so this is done on an object by object basis, such that what you can also do is if I switch this from constant over to say B-spline and then adjust this, you'll see that now rather than getting either blue or red, we actually get a blend between them. And so it can either go all the way to blue or all the way to red, and we get a nice gradual transition. Basically, we're setting max and in. So what is white, what is black, and then it's just choosing one of these values between here to then use as the factor input. So the random value is really cool for allowing, you know, if we have a lot of objects that use the same shader, rather than having to create a different material for each one of them and assign a slightly different color, we can use the random value and then just feed in the different colors that we want, and it will then basically just pick a random one between those and give us some nice variation, all within a single shader and a single material. So very, very cool stuff. Next, some of the things in cycles. If we go over to the render panel here, and we scroll down, number one, you can disable or enable the progressive option right here. If you disable that, then you have the control to set the samples for diffuse, glossy, transmission, etc. Again, I don't know enough about this, so definitely just read the release notes. I don't want to misspeak and then put you guys on the wrong path, but definitely just read the release notes and you can check out between the two. Couple of things with the render layers that's pretty cool now that gives us very good controls is, you know, if you've ever used render layers, they can be very, very handy for doing compositing. One thing that we do have, I believe this was actually added. I don't know if this is in 2.63, but if it's not, we now have the ability to visualize the selected render layer within the viewport. So we can just turn that on. And now you can see that in this layer, I have all scenes layers enabled, and then I'm showing these two, but I'm then able to exclude specific layers. So I could go in here and I could just say, you know what, I don't want to have that layer. So I'm going to exclude it. And it's not going to show up in the reflections. It's not going to show up in the lighting. If any lights are on that layer, it's not going to contribute to that. And so it works really well for then excluding individual sections. So you can see here on layer 2 then, basically I've gone in and I just specified the one that I wanted. And I didn't want even any reflections or anything to show up from those, so I just excluded those. So this can be used as a good either creative tool or extra control tool to specify what you want to happen. Let's look at another example here where on my scene, in this one, let's not exclude, or let's see, which one was it? There we go. So we'll bring this back. So on one of my layers, I have an extra light that I'm going to be showing you. That is this light. let's get rid of this. Here we go. It's this light right here. And this is just a icosphere with a light on it. And it's, it's just giving a lot of strength and kind of blowing out some of these sections. I'm going to use this as an example for the light fall off node. But if we just say, you know what, on layer 2, or in layer 1, I really don't want it to show that light because I'm going to use it for a very specific layer or something like that. Well, then I can simply uncheck that layer and it's going to exclude that. And now instead, it'll only render with my spotlight. And so, very good creative control for very specifying specific things. So one way that you could use this is if you wanted to add in a rim light that's going to exclude everything else, but only show the rim light, then you could do that very easily. And speaking of this light, let's bring that back and let's talk about the light fall off node. So you'll notice here that this light, maybe it's giving me the intensity that I want, but it's giving me these really kind of harsh highlights and it's more than I want. And so the light fall off node, which you can find via the color menu, so it's in color and light fall off, allows us to make the light fall off based on either quadratic, linear, or constant, and definitely read the release notes for each one of these. But let's just say, what, I want this to fall off more, so I'm just going to feed in my quadratic light fall off to the strength value. And that's going to define the strength of the light based on this setting. So, just for consistency, let's bring this back up to 400. So now it's the same as before, but now I have this smooth option that I can then adjust. And as I bring this higher and higher and higher, it's then going to smooth the fall off of that light. And so I can keep the same basic intensity. Now this will adjust some of the intensity just by the nature of fall off, but it allows me to get a much more gradual transition to my lighting if that's what I want. Or if we set this back to 0, if we go to linear, then it's going to basically do the same thing. So rather than, falling off at a nice smooth curve, it's just going to go straight. So just a consistent fall off. Or we can go to constant, which is going to have no fall off whatsoever. And now, you can see all the way back in here where there was previously not light because it was fading out, we now have these harsh highlights. So you can also use this for basically creating a constant light source out of one that maybe you didn't previously have. And so by default, sun lamps are always constant, but regular lights or emission or mesh lights with emission shaders are not constant. But you could create one just like this. So you could create a constant area light or a constant spotlight. Lots of different things that you can do with this. So the light fall off node is pretty cool and allows you to, kind of tweak and fine tune your lights, and particularly the highlights that those lights cause on your objects. Because a lot of times it's very easy in CG or it's actually very difficult to get the exact highlights that you want because it's generally a lot of times they're either too soft or too harsh. And so this just gives you some additional fine-tuned controls for that. So that's it for a lot of the cycle stuff. There's definitely more stuff, but just read the release notes and kind of, see what else is there. But let's take a look at now we've looked at compositing, we've looked at cycles, we've looked at masking. Let's go over to we'll go to sculpting. So sculpting is pretty cool. We know sculpting is pretty cool, but what's happened in sculpting now is that we now have two things. Number one, in sculpt mode, I believe that this is new. We have the clay strips brush that was either added 2.6.3 or 2.6.4, but if you don't have it, we now have the clay strips brush, which is really cool. Just gives us very good clay strip like sculpting, and is very nice for people that like an actual like sculpting workflow, particularly if you've ever worked with clay or anything like that. Makes it very easy to lay down strips. But I believe that might have been added in 2.6.3. Sometimes I lose track of what's been added because I actually work in the development builds on a day-to-day basis, and so I'm generally always working in the next version. But the main thing that's been added is the new masking tools. So up until now, we've never been able to mask up portions of a model out while sculpting, and masking is incredibly powerful and very, very beneficial. So the way masking works now is, by default, we have a new mask brush here, but it may not be created depending on your configuration. If it's not created, simply hit M. That will automatically switch to the mask brush and set this up so that then you can access it at any time. And now within the mask brush, we have the ability to just, by default, just draw in the areas that we wish to mask out. So basically just draws on black. Anything that's black is then being masked out. And we have the same, it works the exact same way as regular brushes. We can increase the strength, we can increase or decrease the softness, the size, whatever we want to do. It works with symmetry, it works with curves, it works just like any other sculpting brush, except that it doesn't actually alter the surface. It merely adds a mask to the surface, such that now I could go over to just any other brush, such as the clay strips, or we'll do the clay strips brush, and now I can draw right over that area, and you'll notice anywhere that's black is not being affected by my sculpting. And so this works really well for, getting all kinds of, if you need to get specific detail or anything like that, it works very nicely. As with all other brushes within the mask brush, if we hold down Shift, it will then smooth out the mask so we can get nice smooth transitions. We can also go in and we've got a few mask options. So if we go down to Hide Mask, we can clear the mask, we can fill a mask, we can invert the mask. And then we can also, if we just say mask out a specific area like this, if we want to hide that area. So let's say maybe I want to mask out the entire ear so I can draw around it. We'll just draw over the ear, something like this. And around, it's on the back side as well, which, by the way, if you don't want it to draw across it, simply enable front faces only, and then it won't draw through that. But now we can go down here, we can say hide masked, and that allows us to hide those areas. In the past, the only way that you could do that is by hitting Shift B to select, or no, Alt B, I believe, to select the areas you wanted to hide, and then it would do that. But now we can actually go in, we can hide specifically the portions that are masked. So that works very nicely and easily. So that was done through the show bounding box or hide bounding box. So those are the masking controls. Works very, very well. It works with textures. So I can add a new texture in here, and then I can mask based on that. So you could, one way that you can use masking is if you go in here, you add in a mask, which maybe we'll just go to airbrush. So we'll mask this whole thing out. And then you could use that to then add in specific detail based on a predefined texture to then get much more control over your masking. So that's masking. Oh, one last thing, as again with all other brushes, as we mask in here, if we hold down Control, we can remove the mask as well. So that's masking. The last thing that I want to look at in this video is the skin modifier. So the skin modifier is really cool because what it allows us to do is to generate a simple mesh, and generally this is used for creating base meshes for sculpting, but it doesn't have to be. It can be used for lots of different things. But basically what it allows us to do is to quickly generate a mesh such as this by nothing more than single edges. And so this is very cool because let's just use an example here. If I just control click to add a new vertex, I can then extrude this vertex, and I need to click mark root on that, I believe. There we go. And it will then basically envelope that form, creating a quad only mesh. I believe it's quad only generally, based around that. And I can then select any one of these points, and I can hit Control A and scale those up or down. I can do the same thing. I could scale this up or down. I can extrude branches out of that. And so this would be really good for creating, if you wanted to create a simple tree brush or tree mesh or anything like that, it can work very, very well. But that's actually not the coolest point of this. One of the coolest points of this is the ability to create the armature. But real quick, before I look at the armature, do note that this works perfectly with the mirror modifier. So if you enable mirror modifier, enable clipping, and then just set the symmetry axis to X, then that'll work very well. Also note that I'm using a subsurf modifier in here. So by default, this is actually what the skin modifier looks like. It doesn't actually, it just basically creates a cube around each vertex and then allows you to extrude those out. We do have a few controls here on the modifier, such as the ability to mark loose or clear loose. So here on this point, this is one that's marked loose, and I can click or maybe it's not that one. One of these. Oh, here we go. Here's an example. So here on the hand, I've basically extruded out, almost mimicking the bone pattern. And this one here, I didn't want it to create a kind of weird area, so I marked that loose because otherwise it does something like this. So by selecting it where I've got a lot of branches coming out, I'll mark that loose, and that allows the branches to better define the overall area rather than each individual edge. So those are some of the things you can do with the skin modifier. But the coolest part about this, and why this is really powerful, because creating a model like this, if you're familiar with modeling and you're comfortable with the tools, creating something like this is pretty quick and easy. It maybe doesn't give you the ability to very quickly modify the shape, so like if I do this, I cursor selected, I can select all this, and now I can just go in, I can very quickly, modify the original shape or model, and alter the characteristics of my mesh or my character. But the most cool thing about this is the ability to create an armature. So if I click create armature, what it does is it automatically generates a rig based around each one of the edges. So everywhere we had an edge, it creates a bone, and it automatically adds in the armature modifier right below the skin modifier, and assigns all the vertex groups. So you can see over here in the vertex data, it's added in all the vertex groups and it's assigned those. So now I can simply go into pose mode and I can go in and pose my model. Now, the reason that it does this is because before doing this, you would want to apply the mirror modifier. So something you might do is you can delete this. You can go through, delete all of the vertex groups, go over to the modifiers, delete the armature, and we'll just simply apply the mirror modifier first. So now this is now no longer perfectly symmetrical, or well, it's perfectly symmetrical, but it's not reliant on each other. I can now create the armature, we'll generate that again, and now I have a rig that I can use for some very basic posing for my character. So when you then combine this with sculpting, you can get some really good control over this very, very easily. So I can then sculpt on top of this model and have a posable sculpt very quickly. Now, this is not a animation ready rig. It's not, super advanced or anything like that, but it gives us the ability to just very quickly repose our base mesh for whatever we wanted. So, if I wanted to go through here and maybe I was creating a basic pose for my sculpted character, then I could do that very easily and very quickly. So that's kind of the power of the skin modifier. It can be used for all kinds of different things. You can use it for creating lots of different shapes very quickly. I actually just watched a video from Roberto Roche, who is an excellent sculptor, and I hope that I pronounced his name right. My apologies if I didn't. But he's got a video on YouTube that he just put up of skin modifier doodling, where he goes through and creates a lot of different pieces of armor using the skin modifier. So very, very cool tool that when used creatively gives you a lot of different possibilities. So that's it for Blender 2.64. There's a lot of different things that I didn't get to show or talk about. There's a lot of little features. If we go back to the release notes, again, a lot of stuff that I didn't look at. I didn't look at some of the mesh tools. Bevel and inset are now modal, so they work based on your mouse. So if you activate either one of them, which they now have hotkeys as well, you can now just move your mouse to adjust those. We do also have a new wireframe tool, which actually, let me just show you the wireframe tool right now, because that's actually really cool. We'll just go over to one of our layers here. So if we select this guy here, the wireframe tool is incredibly cool because it allows us to select a mesh, hit Control F to find the wireframe, and it's right here, and it generates a solid wireframe from all edges within the mesh and keeps it connected. And so you can do all kinds of cool things with this. You can see when combined with subdivision surfaces, you can create this kind of cool, like, geometric mesh of sorts in a way. And so you can do all kinds of very cool creative things with this. There's also a lot of practical things you could do with this. Rather than having to model a whole bunch of tubes, you could simply, create all the tubes that you wanted out of the individual edges, because I believe that this works with edges too. So if we hit wireframe, no, it doesn't work with edges, so it only works with faces. But if you select this face, hit Control F wireframe, then you have things like that. So if you wanted to create a very quick picture frame, just use a single plane and then wireframe that, and there you go. So there's all kinds of different, very practical things that you can do with that. So that's, there's a lot of other things I didn't talk about. We've got, the B surfaces was dramatically upgraded. So if you haven't upgraded your B surfaces already, definitely check this out, because that's one incredibly cool tool. Game engine stuff, a lot of shadow updates. We've got much better collada support, with a lot of different options and such that are very, very good. A lot of other small features in here that you can check out, and of course all the bug fixes then to see if that pesky bug that's really been eating at you has been fixed. But that's Blender 2.64. A lot of really, really cool stuff. It's definitely, as they'd say, an epic release of sorts. A lot of VFX tools, definitely improving the pipeline, bringing a lot of the pipeline directly into Blender, so that if you want to work directly with other applications, you can, or if you want to bring most of your pipeline into Blender only, you can also do that. So again, just expanding the expanding the possibilities of what we can do in Blender, particularly with the VFX side of things.